Hey, before we start today's show, if you like this podcast, please go like us on whatever podcast platform you listen on. We would love it. We would love, especially if you wrote us a really good review. They make a real big difference in how visible podcasts are to that podcasting listening world. So we would really appreciate it. So we are finishing our season on war. We've got a new season in the works, a season on love, brotherly love, romantic love, Christian love, familial love. So look forward to season 2 of Hot Takes on the Classics. And now, without further delay, on with today's show. At the performance, mild protests against the music could be heard from the beginning. Then, when the curtain opened, the storm broke. I was unprepared for the explosion. I left the hall in a rage. I have never been that angry. That is from an unknown attendee at the world premiere of Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Welcome to Hot Takes on the Classics, a gossipy gallop through the best book ever written. My name is Tim McIntosh. I am joined by Emily Maeda. You've joined us for a season on war. And Emily, we are talking about music and art today.
Yeah. So it's a little bit not the best book, but the best music and art.
The best music and art.
Which we're excited by.
Stravinsky.
Yes.
Stravinsky.
Yes.
Before we start, I think you should give people a little bit of your background. You're a pretty decorated musician, and I think people should know that because you're going to be walking us through a few pieces of music. I love these episodes because you hear things that does not have much of any sort of musical training. I never hear it. So anyway, a little bit about your background in music.
Yeah, well, I went to university actually in piano performance. That was my major. So I was, as a high schooler, when a lot of, let's see, what were people listening to? I guess like REM. Is that what people were listening to when we were in high school? Yeah, I was listening to Chopin, and I was a nerd. I'm sorry, I was a real nerd. Didn't listen to any popular music. I listened to classical music all the time.
Do you like pop music?
I do. I like my candy. Yeah. I like my candy.
It's not Chopin, it's candy.
I will tell you that Automatic for the People by REM did become very near and dear to my heart the summer before I was married. I listened to it the entire summer.
You know, those are Georgia guys.
I know it. Athens, right?
Yeah, Athens,
Michael
Georgia.
Stipes.
Yeah.
Do you like that album?
I really like that album.
You like that album so much?
It's not my favorite of theirs, but I think it's a really good album. And do you know the folklore about the title?
No.
It's from a restaurant. There was a place in Athens, I think it no longer exists, that the band members used to apparently frequent. And when you placed your order, I think the way that they would kind of say your order's up is Automatic for the People.
Love it. It looks a little bit, we've just been discussing fascism. The cover looks a little bit like fascist art, I'm not going to lie.
It does. I know. It really does. It's that kind of star-spangled sculpture of some sort.
Yeah, like an arm, right? A fist up.
I think we're thinking about two different album covers.
Am I not thinking of the right one?
Yeah, I think you're thinking of a different one.
Oh, you're right. I am thinking of a different one. But I am right. It is the star. You're right?
Yeah,
but
to
it
me,
still
that
looks a
does
little
look
bit
kind of fascist. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just really hard lines, kind of in your face.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of it. You're right. I'm glad you fixed that. But if we're talking about fascist art, we are coming back to the high art of the 20th century. To segue back.
Yes.
Because we're not discussing REM today, as much as I'd like to. So one of the questions I always ask my students, because I teach modern literature and modern history, and when we get to the end of the 20th century, I always say to them, hey, what if you were going to give this 20th century a name, what would you name it? How would you characterize it? The century of da-da-da-da.
Huh.
So if I were to ask you, Tim, like the 20th century, what would you name it?
That's a hard one, Emily.
I know.
I have two contradictory thoughts. I think one of them is microcosm and one of them is macrocosm. So microcosm, I think the big scientific revolutionary ideas were we got to look at DNA, we got to look at the atom, and we developed the bit. Like, so computers, DNA sequencing, and the harnessing or non-harnessing of atomic power. And I think that those three things kind of gave power to human beings, and we were not ready to control them.
Are you calling it the century of discovery?
No, because there's another century that is the century of discovery.
Well, so then what are you naming it?
A century of we're not mature enough to handle the power.
No. One word. You only get one word.
Explosion.
Oh, I like that. Okay. I always name it, and it's probably just because we study so much historical fact. I always call it the century of death.
Oh, the century of death.
I mean, because in riffing off of what you just said, it is the century where we figure out how to kill each other really well, right? Atomic bomb, like all of the means, the growth in technology isn't just growth and connecting with people more. It's also exploited to kill more people.
Yeah.
But I like the century of explosion. I like that.
Even if we only had one of the world wars, the First World War, we still might qualify the 20th century as the century of explosion, the century of death.
Yeah.
Because that was so unbelievably destructive. Just the fields running with red.
Running with blood.
Yeah.
Yeah. The 20th century, it's interesting. So art and music in the 20th century, I mean, I think it's starting to be called 20th century art, but for the longest time, it was just called modern art and modern music and modern literature, right? Like it was that was the broad heading, partially because of modern architecture. But it's funny now to think that a lot of those creations are now 100 years old, right? I mean, because modern means up to date, new, recent. But it is funny that we call it modern music, modern art, and it isn't really modern anymore.
Right, it's not.
So before we get into it, we were just going to talk a little bit about, in broad brushstrokes, very broad brushstrokes, what characterizes art and music and literature of the 20th century. To me, the first thing that characterizes it across all artistic disciplines is a demolishing of form. Right? Form is of no account. And form actually stifles the creative genius. I mean, that's kind of how it's treated. So Picasso, we're going to see that when you discuss the Guernica. What about William Faulkner in literature, right? The basic rules of grammar don't apply to Faulkner. Yeah. He doesn't need to keep in time. It's a demolishing of form. And we're going to see that with Stravinsky and music. So it's the form is bends to the artist, not the artist to the form. Right?
It's such a fascinating development. And let's take Wagner as an example. Wagner he's a genius. He's a literary genius.
He is.
Reading his books is really difficult.
It sure is.
Part of what he demolishes is, exactly as you said, narrative form in favor of the shorthand version would be stream of consciousness, that we enter into the kind of semi-conscious state, the kind of river of thoughts and feelings and sensations that characters have. And it can be very difficult to track, but if you can track it, Emily, stream of consciousness, especially in confined doses, is extremely powerful.
It really is.
As a whole book, I find it extremely difficult. Like Ulysses is the classic example, whole book, stream of consciousness, a total classic that nobody reads, because it's so difficult to read.
So hard to read.
And so I'm most familiar with literature, maybe you're most familiar with music, but the breaking of form does seem to be applied in artistic endeavor after artistic endeavor.
Yep, it is. And to me, there's this sense of, and actually we just did Mein Kampf. One thing that we didn't mention is Hitler's obsession with degenerate art. But there is this sense at the turn of the 20th century that the culture has grown stale. You know what I mean? People feel like there's nothing left to explore here. The tonal system of music, nothing left to explore.
Yeah.
The landscapes of perspective, nothing left to explore. And so this sort of despair, I also call the 20th century the century of despair, because despair enters in. And, is it the cat or is it the dog or the tail? Which one's leading? Because it's full of despair. I mean, it's fair. We're going to talk about that when we get to Otto Dix. It's full of despair, and it's fair to represent it, and Guernica. So anyway, demolishing a form. You used the word explosion. I used here supernova, but I think both are applicable.
Yeah.
Explosion of style, supernova of styles, right? It's where you had sort of acceptable forms in which you could write, paint, compose music. Now it's everything, right? You've got Dada, you've got Cubism, you've got Surrealism, you've got Expressionism in visual art. You've got 12-tone row, you've got atonal music, you've got dissonant music, you've got minimalist music. Literature, what are the styles in literature?
Stream of consciousness is the one that comes to mind most frequently. I think a breaking of the chronology, especially in novels, that instead of just going from A to B to C, C, A, B, back to A again. And so you deliberately break the timeline, and that comes with a multi-perspectivalism. You can see multi-perspectivalism in Tolstoy, of course, and Dickens, but a kind of radicalized individualism of the storytellers becoming more prominent during this time. What you experience, Emily, what I experience, that we might have seen and occupied the same event, but what you felt and what I felt are so different, and literature is trying to get at that.
Yes. And the individual expression, right, which sort of underlies a lot of this, the individual expression of the artist, the individual artist's take on what's happening around them.
Yeah.
How about free verse and poetry as well, right?
Right.
We don't need to be constrained by rhyme or meter. No, free verse. Another thing that characterizes the art of the 20th century is brutalism in many forms. So we're going to hear it in Stravinsky, but a return to the primitive, not all of this high art, high feelings, elevated ideals. It's what is the primitive? I think we can bring this probably back a lot to Freud, don't you think? Like the primal, the subconscious, the internal, like the deep motivations, and how does that show itself in art? Don't you think?
Vienna in his time is kind of like a zenith cultural capital.
Yes.
But Freud comes along and he's like, but listening below all of it are just these primal drives, like the sexual drive, the drive toward violence. And this is really this is just the kind of like magma and the kind of crust of human personality and of society is kind of settled over the magma of these drives. But let's get back down into these drives. Yeah, I think Freud is a huge driver of that.
Yes, let's mine these internal urges, right? Let's mine them for what they have for us. I think in all the arts, there's a general suspicion of beauty, right? As beauty being superfluous, beauty being what feels nice, what looks nice, and kind of a sense of despair and darkness, don't you think?
So beauty kind of takes on a sort of saccharine taste,
Exactly. Beauty is saccharine. I mean, you can think about it all through the 20th century and sort of maybe 1920s Paris, like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be entranced with beauty. I mean, don't you think Hemingway kind of falls into that? Like, I ain't got no time for that, right?
Right.
Or in the 60s, oh, you just want something pretty, like beauty, not the transcendent reality, but something that feels nice or looks nice, right? That interpretation of beauty. And these artists are like, we are so much more woke, I guess. We're so much more awake, right? We're so much more awake. We're awake to the suffering and evil in this world, and we're not going to sugarcoat it for anyone.
We should get to our music and our paintings in a second, but part of this, I wonder, is more and more people are entering or will enter the middle class in the 20th century. And I wonder if there is a kind of drive or a sort of friction about a friction and a frustration with the upper class's way of doing life. I wonder if that is also a little bit of what's happening here. That's a little bit of sociological speculation. You're not there?
No, because I kind of think that because the middle class is expanding, because it's still the upper class that's basically making this art. And in many ways, they look down on the middle class. You know, this sense of like a suspicion of beauty, it's like middle class morality, right? Like the bourgeois. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not bohemian enough. Like, we are artists, and we
see things that you cannot see in your kind of blinkered middle class mentality.
I think it's that.
I see.
Don't you? I mean, think about all of the modern art that pushes the envelope, and it's like, oh, you don't see why the black canvas is deep and intelligent, right? Because you've got the middle class guy showing up like, well, that's not art. My 4-year-old could produce that. I mean, isn't this the... And they're like, you just don't see the deep meaning in that canvas.
So it becomes a sort of elite game of perception. And if you don't like or perceive what I perceive as a member of the upper class, then, well, you're just not going to be part of the club. You're not going to be kind of like welcomed in.
Yeah. Because a lot of this, too, is the growth of the artist as the prophet of society.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the artist as the one who has the most right to speak to society.
Mm-hmm.
You know, don't you think?
Yeah.
This is the artist is no longer a craftsman who works within a tradition. The artist is somebody who has something to say that nobody else is willing to say.
Because who else played those roles were played by various different types of leaders, and those different types of leaders are kind of falling off the side of the road into the ditch. They're no longer respected positions. So
yes,
maybe doctors are, scientists are in a different realm, and the artist is rising up like Beethoven in the late 19th century to kind of occupy this truth-telling role.
Yeah. Yep. So let's, all of that's a good segue to our first piece of music, which is Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, because as you read that opening quote, like the regular people who were there kind of thought, what the heck is going on here, right?
Yeah.
And the Stravinsky and Nijinsky, who did the ballet, were like, no, this is great art. And actually, I'm going to say, I think the Rite of Spring is great art, but it wasn't comfortable. And part of the reason I think we've got to listen to the Rite of Spring, it's so fascinating because it premiered in 1913. So when I think of the Rite of Spring, like, to me, it symbolizes the entire 20th century.
Oh, wow.
Do you know what I mean? Just because once we listen to it, it blows everything up. And it's like a bomb that has exploded before the bombs of World War I, you know?
Yeah.
But in the same way that sort of the Rite of Spring destroyed all the conceptions of classical music up until that point, like, it's not 1 year later that all the bombs are going to start flying in one. And that society will sort of never be put back together again the same way. So to me, it's highly symbolic of the entire century. So let's just, should we listen to it first? What do we want to do? Okay, let's listen to it first. So we're going to start, and tell me, Tim, if you know what this instrument is that's playing without looking at the video.
Okay. I'll play it. I won't look.
Okay, what are you hearing?
It's not an oboe, but it's a wood. It's a wind instrument.
It's super eerie. It's such an eerie sound. It's such a good call. Most people wouldn't know what an oboe is. Nice job.
What is it, Emily? It's really eerie. What is it?
It's very eerie. And then it just keeps repeating that same call over and over again. That is a bassoon. So here's one of the radical things is that Stravinsky, right from the start, he puts the bassoon into a register the bassoon never plays. So like you said, you can tell it's a woodwind, but it doesn't sound like any woodwind you've ever heard. That's because nobody ever plays it there. It's super hard to play.
So what is a bassoon ordinarily, if we heard it in something from 1800, how would it sound different?
Oh, it's very low. So in Peter and the Wolf that Prokofiev writes, it's the grandfather. It's a very low, one of the lowest woodwinds. So Stravinsky, right from the start, he's going to do something different. And he places this eerie melody really, really, really high in the bassoon's range. So everybody's kind of thrown off.
Yeah, it is.
And then the woodwinds join in, but they're just repeating this call. So this is called the Rite of Spring, and it's about a pagan fertility practice in Russia, prehistoric fertility rite. So the Rite of Spring, welcoming in the fertility of the year, often characterized by human sacrifice, and this is no exception. There will be a human sacrifice at the end of this ballet.
Oh, will there?
Oh, there will.
Okay, so the melody taken from Russia, debuting in Germany?
No, this the Rite of Spring is a ballet, and it's performed in Paris. This is in Paris.
And would Parisian audiences have known the melody? Would it have sounded at all familiar to them? Okay.
Stravinsky's invention.
Great. Okay.
That's his invention. So it doesn't sound too crazy at the beginning, right? I mean, he's doing something funny with the bassoon, but okay, we're hearing these things. But now let's jump ahead, and we're going to go to 4 minutes in, and now you're going to tell me what you hear.
Interesting. It kind of gathers for a second, and then it almost sounds a little bit like a march for a moment. Dun, 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 dun.
But is it a march?
No, it's not a march.
Because the accent is not coming where you expect it.
Right, yeah. It's a half cadence march or something. I don't know.
What are you hearing now?
It's a little bit scary. Now these cellos have come in, and it's really... It sounds... it's not a march, but it sounds a little bit like a horror film.
Yeah, exactly. I know. One of the things that's hard for us to do when we're listening to this is to put ourselves back at the time when nobody had heard this, right? Because you're right, downstream from the Rite of Spring, it has been picked up. Its sound has been picked up. And it doesn't sound so shocking. And yet it's still pretty shocking because there's no melody you're listening to, right?
Right.
There's
like
no
there
melody.
may be segments that are really beautiful, but they don't really coalesce into anything
you can
that
hang
you would
on
call
to.
a melody, right?
Yeah.
Am I wrong? Doesn't part of this sound like a horror film?
Completely.
Soundtrack? And so if you're going to the symphony and you're expecting to hear something beautiful, melodic, based on themes and forms, and you hear this, I'm thinking back to this unknown attendee of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring that we read at the beginning, and he's angered at this. Like he went expecting something lovely, having tea on a Sunday afternoon.
It's the ballet.
Instead, he got Jaws.
Dun, dun, dun,
yeah.
Dun, 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 dun. Okay, now that is so perceptive that you heard Jaws because you did hear it. So when that chord comes in, where you said sounded like a march, okay, it's an F-flat chord. Over the top is an E-flat chord. Those are separated by a minor second. Do you know what the Jaws interval is? Da-na-na-na. It's a minor second.
Oh, is it really?
Look at how good your listening is. That's great listening. So, but the minor second, that dee-da-da-da, it's one of the most dissonant intervals in our system. So the sound waves of those two notes are fighting each other the entire time, right? They never come into rest with one another. And so when we hear it, we're like, like it inspires kind of a horror within us because we never get a feeling of rest with those two sounds.
Yeah.
So that's an example, sort of this little snippet that we listened to at 4 minutes in is an example of sort of all of the things that make this a radical piece. So we have polytonality, meaning we've got two different key systems. So we have F flat and E flat, and they're not by themselves, they're juxtaposed on top of each other, right?
What was Igor doing?
What was he doing? And now we also don't have one rhythm that we can kind of hear. It's polyrhythmic. We've got multiple rhythms going. You said it sounded like a march, which it's supposed to because it's that doot, 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 doot,
right.
doot, right? That driving rhythm. Okay, I've been practicing this for you, but here is how he puts the beats together. He goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Hey, wasn't that good? Did you hear
that
it?
Was really good. And it just doesn't repeat. It's like you can't really find an ongoing rhythm. You're kind of jarred.
Right, because you're used to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
Right, that's a duple beat. Or if you were doing a waltz, it would be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, all of that feels very predictable and comfortable to us. But this moving the beat around, it throws you off.
Yeah.
Right? That's the horror film. Because not only are the tones fighting each other, but the rhythm's fighting itself. Right? And then you have these high instruments sort of coming in. And then, and then another little melody that comes in. But there isn't any predictable melodic development that you can have any sense of what's going on. Right? So in the sense of like mining this primal feeling, you can see how he's doing it in sound.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
This is stream of consciousness in some ways, right?
Yeah. Evoking fear, evoking terror.
Yes. So this is the augurs of spring. An old woman is foretelling the future. And, this is a ballet. So there's dancers on the stage dancing to this, which they're not using sort of the refined movements that ballet has become accustomed to. They're stomping and, flat feet and jumping around. I mean, this is the beginning of modern dance as well.
Yeah.
So, it's crazy. It's polytonal, meaning lots of tonal centers all together, polyrhythmic. The instruments are doing things that they're not used to doing. He's making them play in ranges they're not accustomed to. And all of it is sort of celebrating this primal drive to find the chosen virgin who will be sacrificed. So let's move ahead to that. This is 27 minutes in. This is the sacrifice of the chosen one, or the glorification of the chosen one. So let's listen to this a minute and tell me what you hear. Something's coming.
Starts so quietly, yeah.
It sure does. Ominous alto flute. Once again, that minor second is being played.
There's a little trumpet in there.
Do you hear that tune right there?
Yeah.
It sounds like the Mordor March from Lord of the Rings.
Oh, it does.
Except that we have to know that this precedes it, right? So.
Yeah. little
we get the
trills. I hear
sense
these little
that-
trills kind of in the
Yes.
corner of the music.
The chosen one is being found. Do you hear all the brass?
Yeah, and is the brass kind of the announcing of finding her, or is that bringing her back?
That it's announcing that she has been
Yeah.
taken, right? And you saw also, this is scored for a huge orchestra. You saw all the French horns there playing this unsettling music. I'm like, this now is kind of a regular march. Dun, 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 dun. And sort of that return to regularity maybe is even more ominous from the beginning.
Because it's been so irregular before.
Yes.
And the moment we find regularity is when we find a virgin who's going to be sacrificed. That's a little spooky, yeah.
Yes, it really is. So the ballet keeps going, and then we actually get to the sacrifice. So let's just listen to a little bit of the sacrifice,
Okay.
which is at 33 minutes in, because, but then the ending is so unpredictable. But let's listen just a little bit to it.
Wow, it's so big, so forceful. It's like a thunderstorm.
And you've got all of these instruments kind of doing their own thing, right? There's that polytonality, polyrhythm, but it's all sort of this terrifying, overwhelming sense of doom, right?
Yeah, it really is.
And in some ways, the doom is amplified by the chaos that's going on, the chaos that is still happening within something that's all very well figured out. This is an incredibly difficult piece of music to play. My daughter just played it last year, and it bends the mind, because while it seems like it's completely chaotic, it has been planned.
And she's hearing something in her right ear. She's hearing something different in her left ear. And then she's playing something, a third thing.
Exactly.
Is that what makes it so difficult?
Exactly. Yes.
I was just thinking, I was watching the conductor a little bit and like, who is he conducting? Like, which part of the orchestra is he conducting?
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to read you this quote from this music historian, Donald J. Grout. He said, "The Rite of Spring is undoubtedly the most famous composition of the early 20th century. It had the effect of an explosion that so scattered the elements of musical language that they could never again be put together as before."
Wow. Emily, this is a year before World War I erupts. So I always kind of, in my little telling of the 20th century, World War I is the great crushing of the or shattering of the European psyche.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's beginning to happen even before troops go into battle.
I mean, right. So I think of it the same way. But in some ways, we always know that politics is downstream of culture.
Yeah.
Right? And in some ways, I do think of the Rite of Spring as being sort of that explosion, that supernova. For me, symbolically, it occupies that place. So
it's a really jarring piece. And it is
jarring.
kind of beautiful. There's elements of it in this cursory listening. I've heard it before, but in this cursory listening, like, oh, there's little fawns and pixie dust sprinkled here and there, like these little melodies that kind of flash up and then disappear kind of quickly
into the chaos. Yeah. It's so interesting as well, because Stravinsky himself, was this radical figure in the early 20th century. But by the end of his life, he returned to the church and he composed neoclassical music that you have a hard time. Is that Mozart or is that Stravinsky?
No
and
way.
It was almost all religious music.
No way.
So, and we're going to find this, which it's fascinating to me. We're going to find this with another piece of music, the Górecki Symphony that we listened to. Something similar, a similar turn that some of these artists who started out so bucking the established forms found them utterly compelling by the end of their lives, which is really fascinating. So now we're going to turn to
Otto Dix.
a painting, an Otto Dix. And I'm putting this here. We're going to go to Guernica as well by Picasso, which is more akin to Stravinsky than Otto Dix is, because Otto Dix is not destroying form the way that Picasso will. But this is a memorial to the First World War. And in that, I felt chronologically it makes sense to look at it next.
If you're listening at home, next time you're at a stoplight, if you're driving, look up Otto Dix, D-I-X, the War Triptych. And Triptych is T-R-Y, T-R-Y-P-T-Y-C-H. And
there'll be a link in the show notes as well to this.
It's a really, I keep saying the word jarring. As soon as you look at it, it slaps you in the face. It's a hard painting.
It really is a hard painting. And the triptych, so this is interesting from the standpoint that Dix is playing on a long cultural knowledge in this painting, because the triptychs were used in churches, and they were triptychs generally in churches were of the Crucifixion. It may be like Mary's Annunciation and then the birth of Christ. That was also a common triptych.
Yep. But
this triptych is for sure playing off of the Isenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunwald. So if you want to look that up, that will also be linked in the show notes to see what sort of a traditional triptych looked like. But Otto Dix, a German former soldier, machine gunner in World War I, he, after the war, was really broken by his experience, and he spent the next 10 years creating art that reflected his time in the trenches. So he could be put in a similar camp to Eric Marie Remarque, who we read with All Quiet on the Western Front, that the trauma of the war was so profound that it shaped their art forever after. So in the traditional triptych, the Isenheim altarpiece for sure, the central panel is occupied by the Crucifixion of Christ. And in that, there's there's Christ on the cross, Mary and John are to his left, and John the Baptist actually shows up to his right. And then on the far left panel is St. Sebastian, and on the far right panel is St. Anthony. So that's a very traditional triptych. Well, Otto Dix has turned this on its head. So what do you see, Tim?
The central frame it looks like it's a scene from directly on the battlefield, maybe in one of the trenches. The soldier's face that's most clear is covered by a gas mask, and there's a kind of craned figure over him, maybe in the place where the crucifixion would be.
Totally.
That's a skeleton that's just got rags on his body, and there's really no body. It's just bones at this point. It's grueling.
It is. And then talk about what you see on the left.
The left is soldiers going to war. Of the whole painting, that's for me, the most,
sinister,
organized, or
yes, clear.
Right? Clear. Yeah. The soldiers are, well groomed. They've got their uniforms on. They're clearly marching somewhere. They're in a line. The rest of it is like kind of what happens after it looks like these soldiers arrive where they're going. Just death
exactly.
is waiting for them.
Yeah, and then on the far right.
Yeah, the far right is a white. It's like an ashen figure with a massive gas flame cloud behind it, and that ashen figure is holding another ashen figure. They look like they're cinders.
Yeah, right. Like they've been incinerated.
Yeah.
The face looking out, the figure who's holding the other figure whose head is bandaged, that figure is actually a self-portrait of Otto Dix himself.
Oh, wow.
So you can imagine, I mean, he served, I think, from 1915 on. So he saw a machine gunner too, right? Like he had to gun people down. He saw so much death. So that is a self-portrait. But it is the ravages of war. So when I was looking up art pieces to feature, and I was thinking, what are the great 20th century works on war? I mean, we're doing the two. It's the War Triptych and Guernica. And it's really remarkable because when we did our episode, however many episodes back on, the War of 1812, and there are so many more paintings of war pre the modern era.
Oh.
But I think it's because, like, this is the reality of modern war.
So the glory is completely gone.
Yeah, there's no, like, ranks and ranks of well-suited soldiers on horses, you know? There's nothing to celebrate. I mean, I'm not sure there was anything to celebrate in those otherwise, but
But I understand what you're saying.
Something more heroic.
Right.
And Otto Dix has sort of done this amazing job of showing the horror, like gas, machine gun, like you see in the central panel, the body upside down with the legs in the air, right? It's a body riddled with bullets.
Like, below the central frame it looks like casket. We're getting the side view of the casket in there.
Yes.
Bodies inside.
Right. And this is definitely a reference to, do you know that Hans Holbein painting The Dead Christ?
Yeah.
That almost cost Dostoevsky his faith? I mean, it's a clear reference to that picture of just this dead body.
Yeah.
So horror. But, one of the things that I wanted to think about in this painting is this still is recognizable in form, right? It may be horrifying, but Otto Dix is not dispensing with the past necessarily. He's using the past. He's saying, oh, Christ was crucified. Well, now look at what the crucifixions look like.
Right.
So he's not breaking with the past, but it is horrifying.
Yeah.
But that is quite unlike the painting that you're going to talk to us about.
Picasso's Guernica. So also in the show notes, and it's worth looking at if you haven't looked at it in a while. There's a story behind this painting, Emily, and I wanted to share the story because it's terrifying. It's a terrifying painting, and the story behind it is perhaps even more terrifying. So 2 years before World War II began, Hitler wanted a place to practice his bombing runs, because this is how he's going to subject the Luftwaffe. This is how he's going to bring Europe under his thumb. And so he calls his friend, Francisco Franco of Spain. And Franco says, oh, you want to practice your bombing runs? I have got just the place. Practice it on my little town of Guernica. Think about this. He nominates a little coastal town, best known for shepherding. That's the life that Guernica is living. Little cafes and quiet places. And he says to Hitler that it's the perfect place to practice your bombing runs. So that's what Hitler did. So late April 1937, there is no defense. There is no getting ready for a bombing run. Unannounced, airplanes start flying over the mountains, and for 3 hours, Hitler firebombs this town.
Which is, I think it's the first time that this really happens on such a large scale, right?
Right. Yeah, that I know of.
Yes.
Hundreds of people are burned alive. 85% of its buildings were destroyed. It's unconscionable.
It is. When you see the pictures of what happens to the town, right? It's just
completely unconscionable. So Picasso, a Spaniard, hears about the bombing. He disappears into his studio and I think starts working almost immediately. He comes out 5 weeks later. The canvas is 25 feet wide, 11 feet tall, and the painting is called Guernica. If you've not seen it before, it is monochromatic. It's just black and white and grays. and it is a picture of carnage. It is, and it's done in Picasso's style. So there's a flattening of 3-dimension. The figures that we can see, both eyes would be on one side of the head instead of showing kind of a 3-dimensional representation of a human head. Everything is kind of smashed flat. There's a severed horse head. There's in the center, the top of the frame, there's a light, a kind of a candle that's being held by a somewhat severed arm, but no light is coming from it.
Mm-hmm.
There are shards of light that appear, but they seem unconnected to the two light sources in the painting. So everything in this painting is chopped, rearranged, flattened, made monochromatic, and it is so clearly a protest painting, and maybe the most famous protest painting in the 20th century. So there's a little after story about after Guernica debuts. It debuts 1937, the Paris exhibition. One critic doesn't really understand, like modern art has really not captured the kind of imagination of the critics yet. One critic calls Guernica a hodgepodge of body parts that any 4-year-old could have painted. And today, it might be the most esteemed and valuable piece of art created in the 20th century. The aftermath is that Hitler hears about Guernica painting. And I think part of the power of the painting is he kind of puts a face to, this is what fascism is going to end up looking like. And Hitler tries to capture and destroy the painting. Maybe you could argue the man was sophisticated enough with propaganda that he knew like the kind of influence that a painting like this might have. He was unsuccessful, thankfully, but he saw the power in it and tried to destroy it. And fortunately, it was preserved.
That's so interesting because, well, it's something that we didn't hit as much upon in Mein Kampf, but degenerate art was a big punching bag for Hitler.
Yeah.
And so Otto Dix actually saved that triptych. It was taken apart and hidden by his friends because that was art that was degenerate and that Hitler was going to destroy. He was going to destroy both because for Hitler, anything that did not glorify war,
yeah, the
had
Otto
to
Dix
be destroyed.
Is an indictment of war. Like, this is what it actually looks like.
Exactly.
In Guernica also.
And I think, unlike Otto Dix, I think Guernica is the match to Stravinsky. I mean, there were things in the 20th century already happening like this, but Guernica is that destroying a form, right?
Yeah.
Picasso is not, it looks like newsprint, which he's interested in sort of mimicking, but he is not keeping anything together. I mean, he's already been doing Cubist art, so it's not like this is the first time anybody had seen it. And yet sort of its immensity and scale in that way that the Rite of Spring was also sort of overpowering, in its immensity. This is a huge painting.
Huge.
And
25 feet left to right. Yeah. Yeah. You walk in and you are subject to it. It's not subject to you.
Yeah. And the distortion and the breaking of everything that's expected, it really does stick with you. I mean, it's the thing that says, this is maybe the only right response to the carnage that we've seen, right? How else are you going to represent it that does justice to the carnage that's been perpetrated upon the people?
Emily, have you ever seen Picasso's paintings from when he was a teenager? Like the blue period? Before that even.
Oh, yeah, I know some of them. He
used to just do straight realism.
Yeah, right.
The Picasso Museum in Barcelona, there are tons of his paintings of his, parents, his uncles, his aunts. I mean, if you ever have any doubt whether or not Picasso is a genius, this will end that thought. It's unbelievable how incredibly accurate he could be if he wanted to be, if he was painting realism.
It reminds me, I read this book about the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and how they were so tired of the strictures of form. But guess how they had all been trained? They'd all been trained painting the masters. They were all master painters who then decided, we don't want that. But it is interesting that this loss of form, they could take it for granted because they had already been formed.
I think about, I love John Coltrane, the jazz musician, and I think like Blue Note and some of his albums kind of in the middle part of his career are just so extraordinary. And then he goes through a period that he completely loses form, completely loses form. And I can't stand, I don't know anybody that's like, I'm going to curl up with like late Coltrane tonight and just listen to this like formless jazz.
Yeah.
And I wonder about, this is part of the limitation of the lack of limitation.
Exactly.
When you blow up the form.
Exactly.
Is that you push it. I mean, Coltrane, Picasso, not Dubliners, but Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. There's a complete crushing of the form. And then after that comes a longing for the form again.
It sure does. Which I think is highlighted by our friend Stravinsky.
You do, because he also returned to form later in his life.
Yeah. Should we take a break?
Let's take a quick break. I want to thank Classical Academic Press for platforming us. And I also want to point you to their website, classicalacademicpress.com. Amid these discussions about warfare in the 20th century, you might want something that's a little bit lighter, and you will find it on classicalacademicpress.com. You'll find it for 10% off any product purchase, excluding digital products or bundle packages, on classicalacademicpress.com. When you use the coupon code Hot Takes, all one word, go visit Classical Academic Press or classicalu.com today. Emily, let's talk about one of the, I think, best known pieces of music, I think, in circulation, classical music in circulation. It's so big, it's sort of a caricature of itself now, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, and let's just treat it quickly. But I think this piece was important to include for three reasons. And it's Wagner's The Rite of the Valkyries. So we couldn't leave Wagner out because Wagner was Hitler's darling, for one thing. Hitler loved Wagner. Wagner himself was a huge anti-Semite and really an early progenitor of this idea of the folk, right? The goodness of the German blood. And to Hitler, Wagner's music, unlike that degenerate art of Stravinsky, Wagner's music was everything that music should be. It was valiant. It was militaristic. It had no Jewish taint. And it was heroic. So the Nazis loved Wagner. And if Hitler wasn't at his Eagle's Nest retreat, he was probably at Bayreuth listening to Wagner.
Really? He loved him that much?
Oh my gosh, he loved him so much. And Wagner, I really can't stand him. Can't stand him.
Can't stand his music or can't stand the man?
I can't stand the man, and he is one of the few artists that because I can't stand the man, I have a really hard time with his music.
Right.
And his music, to me, it's funny because his music is revolutionary also. All film music is basically a riff on what Wagner decided to do in his operas. And we'll talk about what that is. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan. It sounds cliche, and I think that's the thing. I wonder how well Wagner will stand up in the ages. I just wonder. But this piece of music, it's used everywhere. I think its most famous use was in Apocalypse Now.
Yep.
Do you agree with me?
Yep. In fact, I just watched the clip. Have you seen it recently? The use of... It's so awful, Emily, because it really does... It reminds me of the story of Guernica. There are these... battle helicopters, American battle helicopters coming over the mountains toward this little Vietnamese school village. And these poor children and the teachers hear the helicopter's coming and they know it's in store for them, and Rite of the Valkyries is playing in the background. So it's such a powerful scene, the juxtaposition of this horrible innocence about to be destroyed with this grand, triumphant music by Wagner. We should listen to some.
Let's listen to it. So it has a similar ominous beginning.
Yeah, it kind of coalesces a little bit like Stravinsky.
Right?
Yeah.
Almost bird calls. And then you hear the main tune, which everybody is super familiar with.
So those trills are violins, I assume, and then that kind of deeper notes are cellos
But the brass is playing that heroic sound, right? And it's actually really simple musical. It's a triad. Dun da da dun 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 da da dun 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 da da dun. Yeah, but while that is playing, you've got these shrieks kind of around it, right? The Valkyries are these women warriors in Norse mythology, and they carry the dead to Valhalla. And they're in this scene, they're carrying the dead to Valhalla. But it's, I think that's why Wagner bothers me, because he's playing on easy things. Do you know what I mean? Like, you feel moved by that, don't you?
Yeah. And you think it's like kind of like musical pornography or something like that? Like it's it's really cheap?
It's a little bit cheap.
Yeah.
So this is the leitmotif of the Valkyries, and that's why I say all film music owes its debt to Wagner, because, in Star Wars, what's the theme of the stormtroopers? Why can't I think of it now?
Right. But it's big, it's forceful.
But every time the stormtroopers come, you see it, right? And then there's the theme for Luke, and then there's the theme for all the different characters. Okay, that's all Wagner, because he says in his conception of what a great opera it was, you combined these leitmotifs that when you heard it, you identified with the character, or you identified with the object. So the rings have a leitmotif, and Tristan has a leitmotif, and I'm forgetting all the characters in the Wagner ring cycle. But nonetheless, so this is the Valkyries leitmotif. And the Valkyries actually are women warriors. They're kind of like the Amazons, which is a little bit interesting. But nonetheless, it does connote heroic qualities, doesn't it?
Right.
Can't you see why Hitler liked it?
Oh, for sure. 100%.
None of this complicated polytonal, polyrhythmic ideas of Stravinsky. No, just give me a one-tone.
Give me a blast. I need a good blast.
That's what the Valkyries is. Not to hate on Wagner, but I really am not a Wagnerian fan.
Not a fan.
100% not a fan.
So, Emily, I feel like we need to transition out of all of this kind of glorying of bloodshed into the aftermath of the glorying of bloodshed.
Nice segue. It's an excellent segue. And actually, this will be our last segment in our season on war.
It's really fitting, because this is such a beautiful piece. It's such a heartbreaking piece. I mean, a heartbreaking piece. I think I've told you the story. I might have even said it on the podcast about when I played this for my dad.
Yeah, you did.
He kind of dismissed it because it wasn't 4-part classical composition. It had only 3 parts. And then I later felt very justified that I found that he had secretly purchased a copy of Górecki's Third Symphony.
It's so great.
It's so wonderful.
And in a fitting move, Górecki is a Polish composer. It was written in 1976, so this is nearing the end of our century of explosion, our century of death. But he had been very much in the atonal, the dissonant, working in Stravinsky's language, let's just say, for most of his composing life. And he started turning away from it. And he was really inspired by medieval modes and old tonal music that you could tell where you were at. So he writes this, as you said, in 3 movements. It's not the real symphony of 4 movements.
Right.
And it's written with a soprano, but each of the movements is a lament. And it's so incredibly beautiful. The first movement is from a folk song, and it's written from the perspective of Mary. And she says, "Oh, my son, my beloved and chosen, share your wounds with your mother." It's Mary at the cross of Christ. The second movement is a lament written by a young woman in a Gestapo prison. And it's written to the Virgin Mary. And she says, "Oh, Mama, do not cry. No, Immaculate Queen of Heaven, always support me." And then the last movement is a mother's lament over the death of her son in a Polish uprising that happened right after the First World War. And the lament is, "Where has he gone, my dear young son?" Isn't it beautiful? So it's couching kind of the suffering of the world within the
3 laments, 3 like mother's laments.
Yes, and it's framed by like the deepest tragedy for the Christian, which is the crucifixion of Christ, right? It's held in that. So we're just going to listen to the second movement, but we encourage you to listen to the whole thing. So let's listen to the second movement, Tim.
This opening sequence always sounds to me like multiple dawns, DAWNS, like or maybe a door opening.
And it's a very simple interval. It's a major third D da dum that resolves, and I think that feeling of like lifting up and then settling, right, like the dawn. But it's so calming after everything we've listened to, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
It's just high strings playing this over and over again.
Yeah.
Calm. It's a feeling of calm. Now we're going to get a new moment.
It goes deeper for a second. It goes lower.
And wait for the soprano's voice to enter. There's that interval of a second, which has been ominous, but it's sad. And she's saying mama, which is mama. Oh, mama, do not cry.
As she starts to climb a little bit.
Exactly.
Emily, the voice matches the strings for the most part up until now. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, definitely. And the soprano is singing way at the low end of her range. I'm sure this is a difficult piece for sopranos to sing because they're used to singing much higher. But what will happen is she starts out so low with mama, mama, and then as she sings her whole thing, Mama, do not cry, Immaculate Queen of Heaven, support me, she's going to rise slowly, and we're hearing it now.
Yeah, there it is.
Oh. We've been in a minor key and we're suddenly now in a major key. Did you hear the switch right there?
Yeah.
Where like it gives me goosebumps because it's been so sad.
Mm-hmm. I want to know about that transition from minor to major key. I mean, I've heard it, but as someone who's got training in music, what do you hear?
Well, for shorthand, this is very shorthand and reductionistic, but minor connotates to us sad. And this is over a whole cultural history of being trained in this, right? It's sad. And then once we switch to that major key, there's a feeling of it lightens, right? Our emotional feeling, we respond to that with a release of sort of sadness. And the composer is playing on centuries of us hearing things that way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't connotate that in every musical system, but in our system, that's what we hear.
Something from the literary world, Emily, is in so many really great works, there's a midpoint almost directly in the middle of a work, and this is not just the middle movement. We're right now in the very middle of the whole symphony.
Yeah.
And there's a change in literature. It's often a change from trying to understand to understanding and taking action.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if that might be something like that happening here.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if it's a taking action, but a sense of it's mama, which is she addressing her earthly mother, right? And then she addresses herself to her heavenly mother, Mary, Immaculate Mother of Heaven. That's Mary. And so that's kind of where it's happening, right? Where she's praying. I would just love to read this short paragraph that Górecki wrote about why he chose this text. Can I read it to you?
Yeah.
The composer recalled, "I have to admit that I have always been irritated by grand words, by calls for revenge. Perhaps in the face of death, I would shout out in this way. But the sentence I found is different, almost an apology or explanation for having got herself into such trouble. She is seeking comfort and support in simple, short, but meaningful words." Górecki later explained, "In prison, the whole wall was covered with this inscription screaming out loud, 'I'm innocent, murderers, executioners, free me, you have to save me.' It was all so loud, so banal. Adults were writing this, while here it is an 18-year-old girl, almost a child, and she is so different. She does not despair, does not cry, does not scream for revenge. She does not think about herself, whether she deserves her fate or not. Instead, she only thinks about her mother, because it is her mother who will experience true despair." This inscription was something extraordinary, and it really fascinated me. Isn't that so beautiful?
It's really beautiful.
And that
having a
symphony
2-year-old changes the way that I hear the symphony and these words.
And that symphony is so beautiful, and I am really happy we're ending our season with this, actually, because it is like war is a great tragedy, you know, for whatever else it is. It leaves so many with loss. And the symphony here at the end of the 20th century returns to places where you and I can enter into it, right?
Yeah.
We don't need specialized knowledge to be moved by this music and this text. Mm-hmm. It's doing what art has always done, which is connect a immortal truth with human beings, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of all things, there is the lament.
We didn't plan it this way, but this is a perfect place to close a season on war, isn't it, Emily?
It really is.
Next season, a season on love, we will do one more episode, which is going to be kind of like, hey, what did Emily and I learn about war? So we can stay tuned for that. Please go listen to Górecki's Third Symphony if you've not heard it in its entirety. Play it from beginning to end. You will
love it.
You will love it. It's absolutely gorgeous. We want to thank our producer, Clark Stefanik, We want to thank True North, our platform. Check out the Classical U podcasts. There's a bundle of them. They're all really excellent. And we want to thank Tom Hagerman, who wrote and performed our music. Emily, we'll see you one more time before we close up this season on war.
Sounds great, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you.